And now I'm talking to John Saunders, the CEO of Shine, and John is also chair of the Mental Health Commission. John, welcome to the programme.
Good morning.
Okay, good morning. I last spoke to you, John, just over 4 years ago in your capacity as chair of the Mental Health Commission. Could you start off by giving me an update on the work of Shine in more recent years and maybe a bit about the work of the Mental Health Commission also?
Well, okay, that's fine. We'll start with Shine. Shine is a national voluntary organisation. It was formerly known as Schizophrenia Ireland, and we're actually celebrating this year our 40th year in existence. And I suppose, in short, what Shine does is supports people with very, very severe mental health difficulties, primarily people with psychosis or diagnosis of schizophrenia, or people with bipolar disorder or very severe clinical depression. And we also, uniquely, I think, in Ireland, we support separately and as well the family members of people who may have a severe mental illness diagnosis. So we have a dual function, and our primary role is around supporting people in the post-critical period, I suppose, and helping them to find a way to plan a recovery journey for themselves. Go on.
Do you want to say something about the Mental Health Commission?
Sorry, yes. The Mental Health Commission, of which I am chair, is a ministerial appointment, and the commission was set up in 2001 under the Mental Health Act, and it has a number of functions, primarily to oversee and inspect the mental health services that are provided by the state through the Health Service Executive, and it does that by inspecting the acute units across Ireland. Most of these units are small units attached to general hospitals, and they provide acute care for people who are very, very severely mentally ill. The other main function of the Mental Health Commission is that it provides the mental health tribunals for people who are detained against their own will under the Act. A number of people each year, approximately 2,400 or 500, are detained because they're so acutely unwell that they need hospitalisation. And under the Act, they're entitled to a review of that detention within 21 days of it happening. So the Commission organises and provides and regulates the sitting of a tribunal to make that decision on behalf of the client or the patient.
I understand that in the Mental Health Commission you issue a report every year that gets a lot of publicity. Yes. There are some poor mental health services in the country, are there, yeah?
Yeah, the problem with Ireland, I think, and it's not a new problem, it's been a problem for many, many years, is that we have a very inconsistent level of service across the country. So, for example, you can be in a county, any county in Ireland, and find really, really good services in a particular town, and then you move 20 miles down the road to another town or another region, and you find that similar services are not so good. It's very difficult to explain why that is so, because most services have the same level of resources in terms of staffing and so on. And to be honest, a lot of services don't have enough resources, but I suppose it's a conundrum as to why some services with the same amount of resources seem to do better than other services. The only, I suppose, explanation we can give is that in many cases where there are very good services, we find that there's very strong local clinical and administrative management on the ground who are determined to provide the best possible service that they can. So I suppose it's about local leadership and local organisation and local teams. That said, things have changed. We have made improvements. The mental health service have made improvements over the years, but there are still huge deficits. And, for example, for the last number of years, the Commission has been very concerned about the fact that despite all the protests and despite all of the policies and arrangements, we do have children sometimes who are admitted to adult units because there isn't an appropriate children's placement for them. Now, that clearly is not acceptable in the 21st century, and it's something that we've been constantly pointing out to both the government and to the services. The numbers have dropped over years. They're not dropping fast enough, and we're still not satisfied that putting a child into an adult environment is the correct approach. I think there are some fundamental issues as well around the hygiene and the layout of some of the units. Remember now that many of the units are up to 30 or 40 years old, and in many respects they're now in need of repair or replacement, and we find some very fundamental flaws when our inspectors visit. For example, basic hygiene, areas not being cleaned properly, poor privacy, worn out equipment in rooms and so on that need to be repaired. So these sort of fundamental issues are issues that are very important.
Would you and the Mental Health Commission ever consider issuing a recommendation that the licences of such hospitals or services should be ended?
We've done a number of things over the years. We've certain powers under the Act. For example, we can put conditions on services, and we do that constantly, where we say to a service, we're not happy, for example, with the decor in a particular unit, and we're giving you 3 months to make improvements. And in many cases, those sort of improvements do happen. But it shouldn't be necessary that we have to put those sort of conditions on a service. We have in the past issued closure notices where we've said to a service, if you don't change your practice or your service, we will close you. Thankfully, in the cases where that has happened, the services have responded. So we've never had to force a closure. What we have done is forced reductions in bed numbers or forced changes because we know or we feel that there is support, sufficient staffing there to support the service that they're trying to carry out. We can also prosecute, and we did prosecute in one case last year, and that again highlighted the need for services to, I suppose, pay closer attention to the types of issues that we're pointing out to them.
Okay, we move on to talk about Shine, because I know it's your 40th anniversary this year. I understand that alcohol and also legal drug misuse can cause mental health problems. Where do you and Shine stand on the issue? It's a big national, international issue now of legal and illegal drug misuse, John, and also in relation to the legalisation of illegal drugs debate.
Yeah, there's a significant issue in Ireland around cannabis use. We've always had a number of people in Ireland who've used cannabis. I think what's changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years maybe is that the quality, if that's the right word, and the type of ingredients in cannabis has changed. So that it has become much more powerful, much more dangerous, much more, precarious in taking it. So it's not simply a case anymore of taking cannabis for recreational use. If you're taking cannabis now, you're highly likely to be taking substances that are more than cannabis and that you don't understand and don't know what's in them. And the result of that is that you are likely to develop quite addiction, first of all. But secondly, some people who are very vulnerable are likely to develop what's called a cannabis-induced psychosis or a drug-induced psychosis. That's a psychosis or a severe mental illness, which is the same as any other psychosis, except that it's being stimulated by the use of heavy use of cannabis or drugs like cannabis. It's very dangerous for all the obvious reasons, and we do know from the research that if young people take cannabis, and it's mostly young people who engage in cannabis use, there is a likelihood or a risk in some cases that the cannabis use will affect the developing brain and will cause huge mental health problems later in life. So there are a number of dangers around it, obviously. And I suppose Shine's position is that we do support people, but our advice clearly is that you don't use cannabis, even though society tends to think it's a very mild, harmless, recreational drug. It's far from that because it's now being used in concurrently with other types of drugs. You mentioned legal medication, that there is a problem as well, where people are buying and selling legally prescribed drugs on the black market, and they, of course, can be addictive, particularly if they're psychotropic medications. And they again are dangerous. You don't take those type of drugs unless you need to take them, and you take them under supervision.
So do you have an opinion on whether cannabis and other illegal drugs should be decriminalised or legalised?
We have a very strong view about it, yes. We issued quite a number of statements in previous years around the fact that if cannabis is to be either decriminalised or legalised, I suppose decriminalised is the better term, then there needs to be very clear warnings that some people who are vulnerable to psychosis may develop a psychotic episode or psychosis as a result of taking cannabis. In the same way that if you have, with cigarette smoking now, it's legal, but there's very, very clear warnings and evidence and advertising around the dangers of using tobacco. So I think we obviously don't want to support the decriminalisation of cannabis. If it happens, we need to be very clear that we all understand the dangers inherent in making that sort of decision. I know there's evidence elsewhere where decriminalisation has occurred of cannabis. I don't think there's any strong evidence that it has reduced the episodes of psychosis or reduced episodes of criminality and other behaviours associated with drug use. So I think we need to be very careful when we assume that some drugs are harmless. No drug is harmless. I think that's the bottom line.
Okay. John, talk in general, what kind of services do you provide in Shine for people with mental ill health?
Well, as I said earlier, Shine supports people in what's called the post-critical period. That's roughly about 18 months to 2 years after diagnosis. We don't and cannot provide acute mental health services, and we shouldn't do that. That's a specialist area that the state has providing. What we do is that we welcome people to our organisation, and we try and give them the necessary social, educational, psychological support to, I suppose, for them to recapture their lives and restructure their lives. People with very severe mental health problems, when the illness happens, they lose, not only are they unwell mentally and perhaps physically, but they lose all of the social structures they had around them. Often things like relationships break down. They may have poverty problems because they've lost a job or lost employment. They may become homeless. They may become involved with the justice system through the police and so on. So they live a very precarious life sometimes. And what we're trying to do is to give people the space and the wherewithal and the knowledge and education, the skills to build a recovery around themselves and to try and get back to what's considered to be an ordinary or reasonable quality of life. So there's a lot of training, a lot of support groups. We have some counselling services. We can do one-to-one sessions. We can help people to regain the type of social skills that they had and that they require in order to move on in life. So it's very much focused on recovery and helping people, I suppose, to help themselves make that recovery.
And how are the voices of service users heard, John, in the advocacy of your organisation?
The services that we have are focused entirely around the person. If you come to us, one of the things that happens immediately is that you are asked to enter into a discussion about what it is your needs are. What do you think you need to help us to help you make that recovery? So developing a recovery plan, for example, developing a list or a menu of activities that you think you need to make your own life better. And that's where it starts. And as far as possible, then we enter, it's not a written contract, but certainly a social contract where we say to people, okay, we will provide this for you and you will hopefully learn and develop and make that recovery over a period of time. Some people stay with us for a very short period of time, months, maybe less, or maybe a bit longer, and other people stay a much longer period of time. So each person is very separate and individual. We have various activities that people engage in, including helping people to become ambassadors if they want. So we have a whole program called Sea Change, and Sea Change is about helping people to voice their concerns and experiences around the stigma of mental ill health. And we've many people who are mental health ambassadors. These are people with real experiences of mental illness and mental health, and who are spending some of their time supporting the Sea Change program by giving public presentations and messages and so on around the stigma of mental ill health. Very recently, this year in fact, we launched a new strategic plan called Making Change Happen. And in that plan, there is the development of a new advocacy strategy which will support primarily families who have people with mental health problems amongst them. And what we're trying to do is get a voice out there for the family and for the person who's affected by mental ill health, so that society understands that this is a significant problem. It's a problem that requires support and resources, and it's a problem that can be resolved for many people to allow them to recover and to regain a useful and ordinary life.
I know the Sea Change campaign you have every year is brilliant, and you organise the Green Ribbon campaign, do you, as well?
That's right. Yes,
yeah.
Green Ribbon is in fact part of the Sea Change project.
Okay.
Green Ribbon is a month in May where we ask the public to support us, not by giving us money, but by simply wearing green ribbons, which identifies them as supporting the whole fight against reducing the stigma of mental ill health.
Okay, and for the people who use your services, but they aren't Sea Change ambassadors, like, how do you measure whether your organisation is doing a good job of providing services?
Yes, that's always difficult. We have some internal evaluation processes where we simply ask people, what is it you got from us? Can you give us some feedback on the training that you did with us, and so on? In our mental health in the workplace, where we work with employees in the workplace, we ask them to give us feedback questionnaires on how good they thought we were. In our other training courses, we have various in-house evaluation tools. We do need to improve that, and one of the things we're looking at in 2020 is actually developing a much more complex, more complex and more structured evaluation process to allow us to be able to say, yes, we're doing this very well, we're not doing that very well, we need to change this, and so on. That takes a bit of work, but we've started that planning already.
The issue of dual diagnosis has been getting more publicity in recent years. What do you think of the dual diagnosis service in the country, John? And do you? I don't believe you use it yourselves or provide these services, do you? No.
We've had people who've presented with, say, psychosis or bipolar disorder, who may also have addiction problems, whether it's cannabis, as we talked about, or more other types of illegal drugs, or sometimes it's alcohol, or sometimes it's prescribed medication. And I suppose where it's appropriate, we do refer people, and where we can, we refer people to specialist dual diagnosis services. Unfortunately, they don't exist by and large in every part of the country. And I think one of the problems we have, and we've voiced this before, is that often the traditional mental health care services, if they're presented with someone who has, say, a very severe alcohol addiction, for example, they will tend not to deal with that person until he or she tries to deal with their alcohol addiction. And then you go to the addiction services, and they will tend, not always, but they will tend sometimes to say, well, we can't deal with your addiction problems until you deal with your mental health problems. So there's a bit of a catch-22 going on there, and some people fall between the cracks in that system, unfortunately. I think what we do need to have in Ireland is a much more joined up, cohesive system whereby people who are dedicated to helping with addiction work very, very closely and in partnership with mental health services and make sure that they provide a holistic or total package to a person. You can't divide easily issues like addiction and severe mental illness. They feed into each other. They're complex situations, It's very difficult to say, well, treat one in one location and treat the other in a different location. That's not a practical, appropriate way of delivering a service.
Okay, John, to come towards the end of the interview, looking at the big picture, what do you and Shine, and maybe the Mental Health Commission, want the government to do over the next year or couple of years to help ensure that we have good mental health services in our country?
I think we have to keep our eye very closely on how we use our resources. We have a policy which says we need to develop community mental health care services. That means community mental health teams scattered across the country who support people living in their own home or in their own community. In reality, we tend to be focusing and putting an awful lot of effort and resources into the acute units, the residential units, where people are brought into either voluntarily or involuntarily for very specific treatments. And I think there's a risk that we put all of the eggs in the one basket, so to speak, in terms of the acute units, and we don't put enough emphasis on keeping people in the community. By definition, if you have enough resources and support for people living in the community to make that recovery, they shouldn't need to make demands on the acute units, and therefore, from the point of view of the individual or the patient or their family, there's a much better quality of life, there's a much better chance of making a significant recovery and maintaining that recovery. The other thing just to mention, I suppose, is that it's a good time in terms of mental health. Ireland is beginning to talk openly about mental health issues and mental illness, and we've gone away from those dark days when people were incarcerated for long periods of their lives in institutions and asylums away from society. We have moved on. It's a matter that's part of our society, part of our community. It's an open debate. There are still stigma issues to be dealt with, but I think we're well on the road to a more of an accepting and, I suppose, involving society that understands that lots of people have mental health difficulties from time to time. Some people need lots of support. Some people need less support, but we need to understand that it's part of our ordinary life.